3 pages arrived at a newspaper, each covered in strange symbols that no one could read. The writer made a promise. Print the cipher on the front page, or more people would die. The newspaper obeyed. When part of the code was finally solved, one sentence chilled the entire country. "I like killing people because it is so much fun." More than half a century later, the person behind those words has never been identified. And he wasn't the only one. Across history, entire cities have lived in fear of killers who disappeared without a trace, leaving behind frightened communities, grieving families, and mysteries that investigators still can't solve. These are 10 serial killers who were never caught. Chapter title: Austin's First Nightmare. The Servant Girl Annihilator. Between 1884 and 1885, the Servant Girl Annihilator terrorized Austin, Texas, killing at least 8 people in one of America's earliest known serial murder cases. He struck after dark, entering homes while families slept before disappearing into the night. Met with no fingerprints, DNA, or modern forensic science, investigators had little chance of tracing him. Each attack left police with more questions than answers. The killings began in December 1884 with a servant named Molly Smith and escalated over the following year, the attacker often dragging his victims outside before vanishing. The panic reached its peak on Christmas Eve, 1885, when 2 women were killed on the same night in different parts of the city, leaving Austin convinced no household was safe. The murders transformed Austin. Families locked their doors before sunset. Armed citizens patrolled the streets, and parents lay awake listening for unfamiliar sounds. Every new victim deepened the fear that anyone could be next. Behind every headline was a grieving family left without an explanation. Police questioned dozens of suspects, but every lead fell apart. Witness descriptions conflicted, physical evidence was almost non-existent, and investigators could never place a single person at every crime scene. Years later, some historians even speculated the killer may have resurfaced under another infamous identity across the ocean, but no evidence has ever supported that theory. Then, as suddenly as it began, the killing stopped, and the killer simply stepped out of history. No suspect was ever charged, and to this day, the Servant Girl Annihilator has no name. But the next killer didn't hide in silence. He sent the city a chilling warning before his next attack. The Axeman of New Orleans. Between 1918 and 1919, the Axeman of New Orleans terrorized Louisiana, killing at least 6 people while leaving an entire city convinced another attack could happen at any moment. He struck in the middle of the night, forcing his way into homes before attacking victims with axes that often belonged to the families themselves. He disappeared just as quietly as he arrived, leaving investigators with almost no physical evidence and no reliable way to identify him. Many of his victims were Italian-American grocers, and he typically broke in by chiseling out a panel of the back door, a signature that tied the attacks together, even when everything else about him stayed invisible. Fear spread quickly through New Orleans. Families slept with weapons beside their beds. Neighbors watched over one another after dark, and ordinary evenings became filled with anxiety. Then the case took an unbelievable turn. In March 1919, local newspapers received a letter from someone claiming to be the Axeman. Signed as if written from the hottest place in hell, the writer announced that he would spare anyone listening to jazz on a particular Tuesday night. Whether the letter was genuine or not, the city reacted. Dance halls stayed open until dawn. Musicians filled the streets with jazz, and thousands of families kept music playing inside their homes. Remarkably, no murders were reported that night, making the letter one of the strangest moments in American criminal history. Investigators questioned numerous suspects over the years, but none could be tied conclusively to the murders. The letter's true author was never proven. Evidence disappeared, and the case slowly slipped into legend. When the attacks finally ended in the autumn of 1919, The Axeman left no confession and no trace behind. More than a century on, his identity has never been established. But the next killer left behind something even more horrifying, a trail of victims that baffled one of America's most famous lawmen, the Cleveland Torso Murderer. Between 1935 and 1938, the Cleveland Torso Murderer terrorized Cleveland, Ohio, killing at least 12 people in one of America's most infamous unsolved serial murder cases. The killer targeted vulnerable victims before abandoning their remains in vacant lots, riverbanks, and abandoned areas around the city. Each discovery shocked investigators, yet the murderer always disappeared before leaving enough evidence to identify him. Most of the victims were never even named, drifting through the poorest corners of the city where a missing person could vanish unnoticed. Which is exactly why the killer, nicknamed the Mad Butcher of Kingsbury Run, could keep hunting. The killings changed Cleveland overnight. Residents avoided deserted streets after dark, newspapers followed every new discovery, and families feared every missing person report could end in tragedy. The investigation became so important that it was handed to Eliot Ness, the legendary lawman who had helped bring down Al Capone. Many believed that if anyone could solve the case, it was him. Instead, the mystery only deepened. Detectives questioned numerous suspects, but every promising lead eventually collapsed. One suspect drew serious attention, yet there was never enough evidence to charge him. Growing desperate, Ness even ordered the shantytowns where the victims had lived burned to the ground in 1938, but the killings had already stopped and the investigation went cold. The case was never closed, only abandoned. Nearly 90 years later, the Mad Butcher of Kingsbury Run remains one of the most disturbing mysteries American law enforcement never solved. The worst, however, is still to come. Next, another killer would stalk the streets of London, leaving police with victims but no answers. Jack the Stripper. Between 1964 and 1965, Jack the Stripper terrorized London, England, killing at least 6 women before disappearing without ever being identified. The victims were found near or in the River Thames after vanishing from the city's streets. The killer carefully avoided leaving behind useful evidence, frustrating detectives and making each new discovery even more unsettling than the last. Investigators noticed faint traces of paint on some of the bodies, suggesting the victims had been hidden in a workshop or garage before being moved. One of the only real clues in a case the press dubbed the Hammersmith Nude Murders. The murders spread fear across West London. Women changed their routines, avoided walking alone after dark, and families worried every time a loved one failed to return home on time. Newspapers closely followed the investigation, while police launched one of the largest murder inquiries Britain had ever seen. Despite the enormous effort, every breakthrough seemed to end in another dead end. Investigators interviewed hundreds of witnesses and examined countless suspects, but none could be linked to every murder. Police eventually narrowed their focus to one man, who took his own life as the inquiry closed in. Yet there was never enough evidence to prove he was responsible. Without DNA or modern forensic techniques, the investigation slowly lost momentum, and the killer was never brought to justice. No charges were ever filed, and the man police suspected took whatever he knew to his grave. 6 decades later, Jack the Stripper is still without a face or a name. Next, investigators in Italy would spend decades chasing a murderer who always seemed to stay one step ahead. The Monster of Florence. Between 1968 and 1985, the Monster of Florence terrorized Tuscany, Italy, murdering at least 16 people, most of them young couples, in one of Europe's longest-running unsolved serial killer cases. The attacks took place in secluded areas where couples had parked for privacy. The killer struck under the cover of darkness before disappearing without leaving enough evidence for investigators to identify him. Despite years passing between some murders, the method remained disturbingly consistent. The same .22 caliber Beretta pistol and the same brand of bullets were used across the attacks. Matched by ballistics and convincing police, they were hunting the same person for nearly 2 decades. The killings changed life across Tuscany. Couples stopped visiting the countryside after sunset, families feared for loved ones on evening outings, and every new attack reminded the public that the murderer was still free. As the years passed, the investigation grew into one of Italy's largest criminal cases, drawing national attention and creating enormous pressure on detectives to find the person responsible. The case grew so notorious it later inspired Thomas Harris, the author who created Hannibal Lecter. Police questioned countless suspects and even secured convictions against several men connected to parts of the investigation, but none were ever proven to be the true killer. Theories ranged from a lone murderer to multiple accomplices, while missing evidence and conflicting testimony only deepened the mystery. Decades later, investigators still cannot say with certainty who committed the crimes. Convictions came and went, but none ever held up as the real killer. Half a century on, Italy still cannot say for certain who the Monster of Florence truly was. But the next murderer may have met many of his victims before anyone realized they were in danger. The Doodler. Between 1974 and 1975, the Doodler terrorized San Francisco, California, killing at least 5 people while leaving behind one of America's most frustrating, unsolved serial killer cases. The killer approached men in bars, restaurants, and nightclubs before gaining their trust. Witnesses said he often sketched people on scraps of paper before disappearing with them into the night, the habit that earned him his nickname. Days later, another victim would be discovered, but the man behind the drawings was nowhere to be found. Some investigators believe the true number of victims may have been far higher than the cases officially linked to him. The murders spread fear throughout San Francisco's gay community. Many people stopped going out alone. Friends watched each other more closely, and families were left searching for answers that never came. At the time, prejudice and fear kept several witnesses from fully cooperating with investigators, making an already difficult case even harder to solve. Police developed a promising suspect and believed they knew who the Doodler might be. However, key witnesses refused to testify publicly, fearing they would be outed or face discrimination. Without their testimony, prosecutors lacked the evidence needed to bring charges, and the investigation gradually stalled despite years of renewed interest, including a 6-figure reward offered decades later in the hope someone would finally come forward. The suspect was never charged, and the case remains officially open. 50 years later, the Doodler's identity is still one of California's most haunting, unanswered questions. Which of these killers do you think could still be alive today? Let us know in the comments. And if these cases seem impossible to solve, the final 4 mysteries become even more chilling. Next, Scotland would spend decades searching for a man known only by 2 unforgettable words: Bible John. Bible John. Between 1968 and 1969, Bible John terrorized Glasgow, Scotland, killing at least 3 women before disappearing, leaving behind one of Britain's most enduring, unsolved murder mysteries. The killer met his victims after nights out at Glasgow's Barrowland Ballroom, earning their trust before accompanying them home. Each victim was later found murdered, and despite similarities between the crimes, the man responsible always vanished before police could identify him. Survivors of that era remembered a polite, well-dressed young man who quoted passages from the Bible and spoke of a strict religious upbringing, details that gave the unknown killer his lasting nickname. The murders cast a shadow over Glasgow. Women became reluctant to go dancing alone. Families worried whenever loved ones stayed out late, and the once popular ballroom became associated with fear instead of celebration. The investigation dominated headlines, while detectives worked tirelessly to find the man witnesses described as polite, well-dressed, and deeply religious. Police interviewed hundreds of witnesses and followed countless leads, producing sketches and investigating several promising suspects. Over the years, advances in forensic science renewed hope, and decades later, a suspect's body was even exhumed for DNA testing. But the results were inconclusive, and no evidence has ever identified the killer with certainty. Every major breakthrough eventually reached the same disappointing conclusion. Every lead eventually dissolved, including the DNA test that failed to confirm the prime suspect. More than 50 years later, Scotland still searches for the man known only as Bible John. Next, a small American city would be gripped by panic after a masked killer turned ordinary nights into a nightmare that inspired generations of horror stories. The Phantom Killer. Between February and May 1946, the Phantom Killer terrorized Texarkana on the Texas-Arkansas border, attacking at least 8 people and killing 5 in one of America's most chilling, unsolved murder sprees. The attacks happened at night, often in secluded lovers' lanes on the outskirts of town, striking roughly every 3 weeks in what newspapers called the Moonlight Murders. Survivors described a masked attacker who appeared without warning before disappearing back into the darkness. Despite an intense manhunt led by the Texas Rangers, including the famous Lone Wolf Gonzalez, the killer always managed to stay just beyond the reach of police. The murders transformed everyday life in Texarkana. Couples stopped visiting the quiet roads outside the city. Families rushed indoors before sunset, and local businesses reported empty streets after dark. Residents armed themselves, locked their doors, and waited anxiously for news that the nightmare had finally ended. Instead, each new attack only convinced the community that no one was safe. Investigators questioned hundreds of people and chased countless leads. One suspect was quietly considered responsible, but he was only ever jailed on other charges, and the evidence tying him to the murders never held up. As the months passed, the attacks suddenly stopped, leaving detectives with no explanation for why the killer vanished as mysteriously as he had appeared. The case was never officially solved, and no one was ever charged with the killings. Nearly 80 years later, the Phantom Killer remains one of America's most haunting, unsolved mysteries. And somehow, the final 2 cases became even more infamous than everything you've heard so far. Next, we'll travel to the fog-filled streets of Victorian London, where the world's most notorious unidentified serial killer created a legend that still refuses to die. Jack the Ripper. Between August and November 1888, Jack the Ripper terrorized Whitechapel, London, murdering at least 5 women in what became the world's most infamous unsolved serial killer case. The killer targeted vulnerable women in the narrow streets and dark alleyways of London's East End, striking quickly before disappearing into the crowded neighborhood. Every murder seemed to expose another failure of the investigation, while the lack of reliable forensic science left detectives with little more than witness statements and speculation. Taunting letters soon arrived at the press and police. One signed Jack the Ripper, another headed from hell, and it was these mocking messages that gave the unknown killer the name the world still uses today. The killings changed Whitechapel forever. Women feared walking alone after dark, businesses closed earlier than usual, and frightened residents formed crowds whenever rumors spread that the Ripper had struck again. Newspapers printed sensational headlines almost daily, turning the investigation into an international obsession. Behind the headlines, however, were families left to mourn loved ones whose deaths would never be fully explained. Police interviewed countless witnesses and investigated dozens of suspects, including doctors, butchers, sailors, and local residents. Over the following century, advances in forensic science inspired new theories, yet none produced enough evidence to identify the killer with certainty. Every supposed breakthrough eventually collapsed, leaving the mystery exactly where it began. More than 100 names have been proposed over the past century, yet not a single one has ever been proven. The Ripper remains exactly what he was in 1888. Unknown, but one killer didn't just evade capture. He challenged investigators, mocked the press, and left behind coded messages that are still being studied today. The Zodiac Killer. Between 1968 and 1969, the Zodiac Killer terrorized Northern California, murdering at least 5 people while taunting police with letters and ciphers that turned his crimes into one of history's greatest unsolved mysteries. The attacks appeared random. Young couples were targeted in quiet, isolated areas, while a San Francisco taxi driver was shot at point-blank range in a well-lit neighborhood. A killing witnessed by teenagers across the street. But the murders alone were not what made the Zodiac infamous. After each attack, letters began arriving at newspapers. Some contained chilling details only the killer could have known. Others included coded messages, daring police to uncover his identity, and he even threatened to attack a school bus full of children. Fear spread across California. Couples avoided secluded roads. Parents worried whenever their children stayed out late, and every new letter reminded the public that the killer was still watching. Newspapers rushed to publish his messages, giving him exactly what he wanted, an audience. He sent 4 ciphers in total. One was cracked within days, but another went unsolved until a team of amateur codebreakers finally broke it in 2020, more than 50 years later. Detectives investigated hundreds of leads and interviewed numerous suspects, yet none could ever be linked to the crimes beyond reasonable doubt. Advances in DNA analysis and forensic technology have ruled out some long-standing theories, but no living person has ever been identified as the Zodiac Killer. Investigators continue to examine evidence in the hope that one overlooked clue could finally reveal the truth. Some of his ciphers have been cracked. His identity never has. More than 50 years later, the Zodiac remains the most infamous, unidentified killer in American history. Proof that sometimes the greatest mystery isn't how the crimes were committed, but how the person responsible disappeared without a trace. Every one of these killers left behind more than crime scenes. They left families without answers, communities forever changed, and investigations that still haunt detectives decades later. Some disappeared because forensic science simply didn't exist. Others escaped through luck, lost evidence, or missed opportunities that can never be undone. Despite advances in DNA technology and modern investigations, many of these cases remain as mysterious today as the day the murders stopped. History remembers their names. It does not know their faces. And perhaps the most unsettling thought of all is that some of them may have lived out the rest of their lives as ordinary people, never facing justice. If you enjoyed this countdown, don't forget to subscribe. Every week we uncover another true story that history has never fully explained.